Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the session today. My name is Monica Dominguez, and I'm one of the members of the Student Leadership and Ethics Board, known as SLEB, the Bernstein Center. SLEB began the Under the Tree series to encourage interactive group discussions among students about the intersection of ethics and leadership among different industries, highlighting topics of interest that are becoming increasingly important in society. Today, we are lucky enough to have Sandra Matz, an associate professor of business, as our speaker today. Professor Matz takes a big data approach to studying human behavior in a variety of business-related domains. She combines methodologies from psychology and computer science, including machine learning, experimental designs, online surveys, and field studies, to explore the relationships between people's psychological characteristics, such as their personality, and the digital footprints they leave with every step in their digital environment. She also works with businesses around the world and is a frequent keynote speaker for established businesses and institutions, including Microsoft, Trivago, and the European Commission. Today, Professor Matz will provide a 30-minute presentation, followed by another 30 minutes of interactive questions. We will pause throughout the presentation to also take questions. Finally, please keep yourself on mute and have your camera on so we can create an inclusive classroom. When you have a question, please use the raise hand function in the participants list and I will call on your name. Without further ado, welcome Professor Matz.
Thank you so much, Monica. Thanks for organizing. Thanks to the Bernstein Center also. And it's really nice to see some of you. So Chloe, Raphael, I know some of the other names are new, but it's exciting for you to see you. And it's really nice to know that even though everything is remotely right now, that we still have these events where the community comes together. So I'm excited and I'm super happy to make this a lot more of a conversation, right? So I've prepared some slides. I think some of you, the folks from my negotiations class, they probably know some of it already. But I really want this to be much more of a conversation because I think when it comes to ethics, when it comes to data, that's what we need, right? It's like ethics is not one size fits all. It's not that I can tell you here's exactly what you should be doing. A lot of it has to do with your personal values, your personal moral foundation. So like really thinking about some of these things and discussing them as a group, hopefully at some point also with the public in a broader sense, I think is just the most valuable thing that we can do. So I'm going to start sharing my slides, but as Monica said, feel free if you have questions throughout, I try to monitor the raise hand function. If I don't see it, then just feel free to interrupt. But it's really, I think it's probably more interesting if we have questions throughout instead of saving all of them for the end, especially since it's like a small group and we can do that relatively easily. So let me start sharing my slides. And this is really the idea behind the session is kind of taking a relatively broad perspective on this topic of how is privacy, how have our ethical considerations when it comes to data protection, when it comes to self-determination, and changed in the age of big data, where we know an awful lot about what it is that people do on a daily basis. And just to give you a little bit of background on where I'm coming from and the focus that I've been following in my research and with this, I was born and raised in Germany, as I'm sure you can hear. But then I moved to England and I did my PhD in psychology. So my background's in psychology. And I then got a little bit more interested in the computer sciences at Cambridge University, with the focus of my PhD being psychological targeting. And if that sounds familiar, I think that's oftentimes because you might be familiar with the case of Cambridge Analytica, which is this consulting company in the UK that claimed to have been involved in the presidential campaign of Donald Trump, in the campaign of Ted Cruz, in the context of the Brexit referendum. And what is known in the media is essentially that they have been harvesting Facebook data of millions and millions of people, annotating that data with psychological insights, and then using these insights to influence behavior in the context of elections. Now, I don't have anything to do with Cambridge Analytica, never worked for them, never had anything to do with what they were doing, but I'm in so far related as in I was part of the group who helped the journalists who wrote about this in the first place break the story, understand the science behind it. And because it is so closely linked to what I'm interested in terms of my research, I've been thinking a lot about these ethical questions of like, how do we use big data in a way that benefits companies, right? Because there's so much value in learning something about the market, learning something about customers, learning something about employees. So how can we leverage these opportunities that data provides, but at the same time avoiding some of these pitfalls that come with it when it comes to privacy manipulation and potentially undermining people's ability for self-determination. So where I want to start, and for me, this is just like super important because I hear this all the time. So I give public talks, I kind of a lecture, and there's oftentimes at least one person who's like, I don't care about this. You can collect as much data as you want about me because like this notion of privacy, it's dead, and I don't care about it really because I have nothing to hide. And to some extent, that might be a valid argument when you think about the fact that some people have it easier to disclose stuff about themselves than others. But the fundamental idea that privacy is dead, in my opinion, is just wrong. So if you just think about how many people use encryption software to, for example, encrypt their emails, encrypt their private messages, how many people simply use a password to protect their accounts, right? So you don't let everybody kind of access your bank account or your private messages. And if you take this to an offline analog, how many people are using curtains? This notion that people don't care about their privacy, I think that's just not true, right? So there is this fundamental need. And if you look at it, it's like really interesting because if you look at it across history, across cultures, there are references to privacy across the board. There's references in most of the religious texts that you see. There's references across all these historical bodies of text and descriptions of people's values that do highlight that privacy is something that is universal and that is a fundamental human need. However, what I agree with is that it's changing quite rapidly, which makes it all the more important that there is someone leading this change, right? So if organizations are transitioning to using more data to benefit customers, employees, whatever it is, then there needs to be someone who actually understands how this data is not just useful, but also potentially poses risks to people's privacy and raises these ethical concerns. So I'm not gonna, before we dive into some of the ways in which we can actually leverage data to gain insights and showing just how intimate and personal a lot of the seemingly innocuous traces are that we're leaving in the digital world, I just very briefly wanna touch on this notion of what is privacy. And I'm not gonna give you an Oxford Handbook dictionary definition, but I wanna kind of highlight a distinction that I think is really important when we think about how big data is challenging privacy, and also when we think about the solutions that we could potentially come up with to reinstate some of that. So privacy isn't about secrecy, right? It's not about you keeping all the information that you have from everybody else around you. What it is, it's about control. So you want to be the person in charge of deciding who gets the information that you distribute. If you lose that control, then that's a violation of privacy. And the example that I like, and this is like pre-COVID when we were all allowed to travel, hopefully we're going to get there soon. But the idea that if you go on a holiday, right, you take pictures and it's not that you don't want to share these pictures with anyone. Because oftentimes it's really nice to post them on social media, to share them with your friends, share them with your family, such that people can actually be part of your life and see what you're experiencing. But you really want to have control over who sees these pictures. So you might be happy to post them on social media because you expect your friends and your family to see them. But if you learn that they're then being used to predict, for example, your political ideology, your personality, or they're being used by third parties to target you with specific ads, that might be a context in which you would say that your privacy is being violated because you didn't have the control over what was happening with that information. And we're going to come back to that again and again, because it's really like this critical element of how is data being used and not necessarily just what data is out there. Okay, so I've structured this in 3 big parts. And the first one I like because it really shows how like data is, first of all, it's everywhere, but it's also so much more intimate than most people realize, right? When you think about your credit card spending, or you're just using smartphones, your social media, most of us don't really think about it much in terms of what are the traces that we leave. But what we've seen over the last couple of years is that they're just so much more revealing of not just what you do, but also who you are, that they're becoming a real challenge for privacy. And then the second part, I want to look at essentially what are the things that we can do with such predictions. So if I can predict your personality from your Facebook profile, what does it mean in terms of us being influenceable by other parties, us being malleable in our behaviors, us being potentially open to manipulation. And then the third part kind of takes it to the next level and thinks about solutions. So I don't want to leave you at this stage where it says it's terrible because we can make highly intimate predictions, this can be used to manipulate us. I also want to kind of then take this final step to say, okay, what are some of the solutions that I think are really interesting when it comes to this trade-off between how useful is it, what are the insights that we can gain, but also what does it mean for privacy? You'll see, we're going to get there. But so this is a statement, and again, like feel free to interrupt at any point in time. But this is a statement that I'm sure that many of you have heard, like data is the new gold, data is the new oil. One of my favorite quotes in this context comes from the behavioral economist Dan Ariely, who a couple of years back in 2013 said, big data is like teenage sex, everyone talks about it, nobody really knows how to do it, everyone thinks everyone else is doing it, so everyone claims they are doing it. Which I think was a really accurate characterization of the field of big data in the early days, right? It's like this hot topic. It was like super sexy to call yourself a data scientist, and company was just like, let's get more data because that's what we need. I think what we've all learned over the years and what he's kind of alluding to here a little bit, it's not the data per se. Right? Data per se doesn't give you anything. Like if you think of oil, like the raw materials are not really valuable. What you want from data is to get insights into, again, customers, employees, the market, that you can then use to make decisions that are based on that data. And so I just want to give you a few, and there's many ways in which you can do that. So obviously you can look at macro level factors of how our market's developing. You can look at like investment decisions. What I'm mostly interested in is really kind of thinking about what can data say about us as individuals, right? So what are the insights that we can get from all the traces that we leave about who we are as a person? And this might not come as news, but like your data is extremely revealing of things like where you are. So we all have smartphones that we carry with us pretty much 24/7, and they're incredibly intimate in terms of the information that they provide. If you think about it, like if you have your GPS tracker on, I can see exactly where you go, when you go there. You can make inferences about who you meet by kind of creating these co-locations. I can very easily infer where you live, because that's where your phone is at night. It's stationary. That's where you always return to at the end of the day. It's super easy for me to infer where you work, because that's, again, usually you have a routine and you go there on a daily basis. So when people think of these GPS tracking devices, we don't usually think about how this is really like someone is following us around 24/7, knowing exactly what we do at any given point in time. And you can imagine that gets exaggerated in a way by the fact that we now have CCTV cameras pretty much everywhere. There's no way that you can get through Manhattan without being seen by a camera. And if you combine it with facial recognition, it really means that someone has an idea of where we are at any given point in time. It also means, and you can plug in pretty much any type of digital footprint that you want here, it also reveals who we are. So pivoting from GPS data to purchasing data, for example, we know that it only takes 3 data points to uniquely identify you in a really large sample of credit card metadata. And that's just because like spending leaves such a unique trace, right? So if you think about someone purchased a coffee at 8 a.m. at Starbucks in a specific location. They had lunch in a specific place somewhere in Midtown Manhattan, and then took an Uber to Columbia campus, for example. There's likely only one person who has this unique signature. So if you combine this information of what you buy, where you buy it, and when you buy it, you very kind of quickly get to only one person that has the signature. And that's true for GPS data too. So oftentimes companies argue that credit card metadata, for example, is anonymous because we're not publishing it with names associated with it, or we can publish GPS records. It's not true because like our signatures in terms of data are so unique that it's super easy to very quickly pin it down to a single person. Now, what I'm personally the most interested in my research is essentially it's taking a somewhat broader perspective. So it's not trying to single out a person or an individual, but it's asking this question of like, how can we use this data to gain insights into who you are in terms of your psychology, right? So all of these traits that we know are to some extent driving human behavior, driving our decisions, driving the choices that we make. That could be personality, that could be like political ideology, intelligence, mental health, you name it. Is it possible to use these traces that we can gather from, again, your social media, credit card spending, GPS location, and turn them into signals that tell us who you are, tell us about your preferences, your needs, your motivations, concerns, and so on and so forth. So this is research that I've been focusing on over the last couple of years. And I think this is one aspect why Cambridge Analytica felt so outrageous, is that people could suddenly understand it, right? So if I tell you, oh, I'm collecting all of your Facebook likes, I'm collecting all of your Facebook statuses, your GPS data, most people don't think it's very intimate, it's necessarily a bad thing for companies to collect that. If I can tell you, look, based on your Facebook, I can predict with really high accuracy whether you're an extrovert or an introvert, whether you're heterosexual or homosexual, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, then suddenly this gives people this sense of, oh, the data traces that I'm leaving, they're much more intimate than what I thought. Because now we're suddenly putting this meaningful label on top of this data. And I don't want to go into too much detail of like the machine learning mechanisms that are behind it. It's actually honestly not complicated. Like any first year CS computer science students could easily do that. But what I want to show you instead is essentially examples for how your behavior online maps onto some of these personal traits. Because I think for me, this is when I first saw these findings, this was really this aha moment that I had when it was like, no, like all the traces that we leave, they're incredibly intimate. And it's not surprising that we can make all these predictions about you just by looking at your Facebook profile, so on and so forth. I'm just going to give you a few examples here. So most of it is coming from Facebook. So you'll just have to trust me that we can make very similar predictions from other sources of social media data, again, credit card spending, GPS sensor, you name it. Any trace that you can leave in the digital world is to some extent predictive. But what you see here, so those are the words that are most predictive of being extroverted. So one of the personality traits in people's Facebook status updates. So those are the things that people write about themselves. And you can see it makes a lot of sense, right? So extroverts talk about parties, amazing weekend. They have like this exciting life. And then introverts look super different. So introverts talk about all the things that you typically do by yourself. It's much more reserved. It's much more introspective. Here is my favorite one, which I think once we saw this one, we're like, no, there is definitely something to this. So this is the personality trait of high agreeableness, which are people who are trusting, caring, empathetic. So they care about their social relationships a lot. And again, you see this warm glow in this word cloud where they talk about praise, love, wonderful, happy. So they're just having this very happy time. The word cloud for the low agreeableness, so those are people who are more critical and competitive, looks extremely different. And we're not cherry picking. So it's not that we're just picking the words that we thought are like the funniest. And it's also not the case that if you're low on agreeableness or you're critical and competitive, that you swear all the time. What you see here are correlations. So it just means that if someone happens to swear on Facebook, their likelihood of being disagreeable just kind of shoots through the roof. We can do the same thing with Facebook likes. So again, those are very explicit signals of who you are and how you want to be seen by others. And you see the same picture. So introverts are kind of following all the things that are relatively introspective, like computers, Stargate, all the stuff that you do by yourself. And extroverts all the social stuff that kind of have excitement and have this social element to them. The reason why I think the Facebook likes are actually interesting is, so this is work that was done by one of my colleagues when I was still at Cambridge. What she did is, so they built models that take all of your Facebook likes, they predict your personality, and then what they do to get a sense of how accurate those predictions are is they compare the computer-based predictions to those judgments made by people in your environment. So they ask your work colleagues, please kind of fill this questionnaire to rate Raphael's personality and kind of give us the best guess that you have in terms of how Raphael sees himself. And now we can compare that, right? So we can compare how good is the computer judging your personality, how good are your work colleagues, your friends, family members, and spouses. And what they find was essentially that the computer only needs 10 likes to be better than someone's work colleague in predicting your personality. And that's nothing, right? So 10 likes is pretty much nothing. And they need 65 likes to be better than someone's friend, which is already really surprising because friends should technically know you pretty well, right? So they are typically spending a bunch of time with you. They see you in different contexts, and if the computer only needs 65 likes, forget about all the other traces that they're collecting. 65 likes is enough to be better than your friend, 120 to be better than someone's family member. So that includes siblings, parents, kids, and about 300 to be better than someone's spouse. Now, at the time that the study was collected, the average number of likes was about 230. So that means that the computer, just by looking at your likes, again, this is one single data source from Facebook that is somewhat curated, already means that the computer has a better idea of who you are and how you see yourself than pretty much everybody in your environment. So the predictions that we can make here are really accurate. This is the last one in the series of examples that I want to give. And the reason for why I think this is important is, again, like coming back to this idea that we have cameras pretty much everywhere now. There's just no way of escaping these predictions, right? So I can say, I don't want to use a social media account. I'm not posting. I'm trying to leave my phone home as much as I can. It's really difficult to do that consistently because you're using your credit card and you're using your phone. But as soon as we can predict some of these things based on your appearance, and we know that there's cameras out there, there's just no way of escaping that. Like there's no way that you can leave your face at home. So this is predictions that we can make from faces and people's profiles pictures. And again, like they do make a lot of sense, right? If you look at they do make a lot of sense in terms of the stereotypes that we have. So introverts, you can see that there's like glasses, and those are just merged pictures of the faces that the computer predicted to be the most introverted and the most extroverted. And you can see there's like a glasses outline. It's like a wider face. Extroverts just have much bluer eyes, which means they're probably wearing contact lenses. They also probably dye their hair because you can see that they're kind of, they look much more blonde. One of the things that I find interesting is that extroverts seem to be better at taking pictures. So for introverts, you do see nostrils, which means that they're likely taking the pictures from somewhere from below, right? So they don't necessarily care as much about the pictures. And for extroverts, they're most likely doing like the duck face from above. So you can even see, so some of it is just grooming and like how you present yourself, but there seem to be differences that might be driven by hormonal differences when it comes to the way that people look. And where I think this is really critical is that I think this is only going to get worse, right? So now we're talking about Facebook and we're talking about credit cards. It's very likely that not too far in the future, we have contact lenses, for example, that capture pretty much everything we do. So it's not a phone that's in our pocket. It's a data tracking device that's in our eyes, captures everything we do. And to some extent, what this also allows, and this is also to some extent the transition to the next part, is that once we have this in our eye, it means that it's not just capturing, but it also kind of then gives us an opportunity to say, okay, I understand who you are. And now I'm going to display like hyper-personalized information specifically to who you are and what you potentially want to see, right? So if we're thinking about echo chambers, we're now complaining how people on Facebook have different realities because their newsfeed looks different. Once you move to these contact lenses, and you say, I'm capturing every single moment. It's not just who you are as a person. It's not just you're extroverted, but you're also in a specific situation. And I'm using that information to display information to you that is specifically targeted at you, then we might be living in entirely different realities. So I think that's really my concern of not just social media, but like, where are we going with this? Okay, and here's a moment, because I sometimes get very excited, but here's a moment that I would love to stop and see if there's any questions about this part in terms of predictions that we can make about people before we transition into the second part of how do we use it. Yeah, Joshua.
Thanks so much for sharing these examples. I'm just curious about the studies that you shared. Is the baseline in each of those like self-reported personality traits, like the introverts and extroverts?
So a great question. So in this case, we're predicting the self-reported personality traits. So right now, and you can do different things, right? So you can predict self-reported personality traits. Sometimes we have access to other reports. So that is, again, like people in your environment, how do they see you? What you see, and I think that is interesting, is that oftentimes when you make predictions based on people's self-reports from data, and you then use it to predict something else. So let's say we assume that extroverted people have a higher likelihood of ending up in a marketing role. That's probably true. I'm making it up still. So what you see is like, even if you use the self-report as the initial gold standard that we're predicting, the predictions that we can derive from that sometimes are still better at predicting the outcome than the original self-reports. And I think that's just because we're getting rid of some of the noise and the curated aspects of personality that you get in these self-reports. Any other questions about this? Cool, then I'm gonna move on, and I'm sure that, so again, like if there's anything in between, just jump in. Okay, so let me just go back quickly here. So one of the questions that I was focused on a lot in my own work is essentially saying, okay, we can make all these predictions, right? So based on your data, I can have a pretty good understanding of your motivations, your needs, your preferences. How can this be used? And Cambridge Analytica obviously was a pretty negative example of how this can be used to manipulate people to do stuff that they don't want to do. And this is some of the things that some of the research that I've done is essentially showing that this is actually the case, because like the entire Cambridge Analytica story was just based off on this claim of Alexander Nix. So like, we did this, and then it came out in the media, there was an outcry, and then they said like, no, we actually didn't do it. So I started this research, I think in 2014, way before Cambridge Analytica, but it was nice because it then to some extent provided this justification of saying, forget about Cambridge Analytica. I don't care about whether they used it or not. We know that it's there, right? And it's effective in changing behavior. So what we should be thinking about is like, how could this be used in the future? So the context in which we started in was essentially leveraging Facebook, the Facebook advertising platform. And that's just because it allows us to run advertising in a way that's already targeted. And we're just leveraging what they already have to make it such that we target people based on personality. It's not something that they allow explicitly, right? So Facebook doesn't allow you to say, I want to reach out to extroverts, I want to reach out to introverts. But what they do is essentially they have, and this is a screenshot from the Facebook advertising platform, is that they allow you to target people based on age, gender, but also based on interests. And now if you think back, this is the list of likes that I've showed you before. If we now know that certain interests, certain behavioral traces are associated with certain personality traits, it's pretty easy for me to say, here's a list of interests, of behaviors that I want you to target. And by association, what that means is that we're targeting people who are more likely to be extrovert than the average person. This mechanism is super crude, right? So we're not taking someone's full list of Facebook likes. We're not making an individual level prediction. All we're saying is that if someone is associated with at least one of these likes, we're just assuming that they're more extroverted than the average person. It's an audience and we're making mistakes within that audience, but on average, this group of people is still more extroverted than the average person that you can think of. And what we did in this case, and there's many different ways in which you could do that, right? So you could think about like knowing that someone is extroverted, you might choose a certain product that you want to advertise them that are just more extroverted. What we did in this case is essentially saying that we're keeping the product constant and we're just changing the message. We're just changing the way that we're talking about it. which to some extent I think is the closest you can get in terms of like political messaging. Is like the candidate you're advertising is the same. You might pick on different topics, but to some extent, it's really just kind of trying to see what is driving someone's behavior and then playing into that behavior. So you see that the extroverted, so in this case, we advertised a beauty retailer in the UK, which is essentially like an online store. We wanted to get women, in this case, to click on the ad, go to the store and purchase something. And the marketing team came up with a set of introverted ads and a set of extroverted ads. And you can see that they have pretty good face validity, right? So the extroverted ads, it was like always multiple people, there was something going on, it was like social, it was exciting. The copy would say something like that, it's like no one's watching, but they totally are. So that's playing with the need of extroverts to be the center of attention. And then introverted ads were always like much more reserved. It's usually one person in front of the mirror. And it would really highlight this idea that beauty isn't necessarily for other people. Beauty is something that just helps you to make the most of your me time. The experimental design is super simple. So again, those were ads that were run on Facebook over the course of 7 days. And the idea is that we have different target groups defined through these list of likes that we knew were more introverted or extroverted. And we had these different messages. And the idea was that if the message matches the audience, people would click more often and purchase more often. So if we use introverted messages to reach out to introverts, they would purchase more often. And if we use extroverted messages to reach out to extroverts. And so just to give you a sense of, again, this was a campaign that we ran back in, I think it was 2015 in the UK. So 6 million impressions, 10,000 clicks and 400 conversions. What I should say is that it was a relatively expensive beauty retailer. So the conversion rates that you'll see are relatively low. And that's just because the average price for each conversion, I think, was around $60, $70. So there's like a pretty big barrier to actually purchase something. So just forget about the absolute conversion rate that you see here. You can get the same graph, by the way, for return on investment. So I'm just showing you here conversion rates, but it looks pretty much exactly the same. And what you see is, again, like as we had expected, the matching conditions. So figuring out a message that appeals to introverts, figuring out messages that appeal to extroverts, they on average kind of lead to more conversions on the website. So it just means that people take action, they think of the beauty retailer in a specific way, right? The product is exactly the same. We didn't advertise different products. It was just kind of go to the website and purchase something. And it still meant that people had a different idea of what the beauty retailer means, which also suggests that these estimates are super conservative, right? So the targeting was super crude, and the only thing that we actually customized was the ad. So once they had clicked on the ad, the website looked the same for everybody. So relatively, I think, conservative estimates of the effect. Now, one of the things that I felt was interesting to briefly touch on, and I'm going to come back to this a little bit more in the context of the solutions, is that there have been changes that you see in industry in response to this ability to target people, and then also this ability to track and reach out to people who have a certain profile, right? So Apple has been quite leading in this field. So they've gotten rid of like third-party cookies a while ago. They also at some point stopped, and this is relatively recent, they haven't fully implemented it yet, but the idea that you can no longer track devices. So advertiser IDs is just like a way for advertisers to kind of track you across the internet to see exactly what your device is doing. So it's no longer just your browser, it's your iPhone. And Apple said that we don't want this. For privacy reasons, you can also imagine that like Apple is a B2C company. And so for them, the customer is who they care about, right? Facebook is a B2B. So for them to get rid of this tracking would just mean a huge loss in profit. So Apple has like a little bit of an easier time here. You also, and this is super recent, is that Google announced, oh, this is actually not the one that I wanted, but Google announced that they're actually kind of trying to revamp their privacy policy in terms of cookies. So they're changing the way in which they allow third parties to track people. So again, like Google, it's a bit of a different story because Google is mostly search advertising. So for them, tracking people across platforms and allowing other companies such as Facebook to track people and then use it for their advertising purposes also obviously isn't necessarily what they want. But it still means, I think the field in general, there's like a few big companies that are driving this change in terms of we don't want to track people at any given point in time to create these really holistic and highly intimate profiles. Yeah, Bjorn.
Hey, thanks for that. It's very, very interesting. I have a question, and maybe just I'm interested in your view. So I work in insurance, and I think, so in my view, targeting, which sounds quite innocent, and discrimination, which I think sounds a bit more severe, are just two sides of the same coin. And for us, targeting effectively just means discriminating against certain types of customers. So in a way, who do you think should be responsible for regulating behaviors in this space? Is this something that should be? I mean, there's an ethical responsibility that certain companies have. Then obviously there's an element of self-control and self-governance, but I think there should be something that's sort of beyond that. I'd just be interested in your views.
I think it's an excellent question, and I'm going to come back to that in a little bit more detail later. But I think for me, that's the biggest question, right? So the question is like, this stuff exists. And I do think in many ways it can have like very positive use cases. So I just showed you the one with advertising. We've shown the same thing in getting people to save more. So again, like in the same way that I can encourage you to spend more by envisioning a certain outcome that matches your needs, I can also encourage you to save more. We can help students, for example, finish their degrees. There's all of these good things that we can do within. But there's a huge potential for this to be abused, right? So I think that's not necessarily just for psychological targeting, but you could imagine that if I know that you're impulsive or I know that you're neurotic in the context of insurance, like who wants insurance? It's like people who are neurotic, people who are conscientious. And then you can think about, well, the people that I want to target are the people who are neurotic because they want insurance, and the people who are conscientious because they're never going to claim the insurance. And if you don't fall into this bucket, then either you have to pay a higher price or you're not getting the service altogether. Same in the context of loans. And I think that's a huge issue. And there's multiple ways in which I do think we can address that. I do think we need regulation, and I'm going to come back to that later on. I think it's by no means enough because it's incredibly slow, but I do think we need it as a signal. So it's like regulation to some extent is a signal of this is something that society cares about. So now companies at least have to think about how they might change their business models. And I think it's really hard to put it on consumers. So as you said, like to some extent, we should be responsible. I think there's just almost no way that consumers can really be responsible for their data because it's just incredibly complex, right? So this notion of informed consent that we've been building all of our privacy laws and all of our privacy protection on just doesn't hold anymore because it might be consent, but it's almost never informed consent because people simply don't have any sense, right? Even if I show you, here's the data that I'm collecting about you, people don't know, like, what are the inferences that I can make about that person from that data? How can I then use it to influence their behavior? This is just like, I work in this space and every day I learn something new that I wasn't aware of. So I think like putting it on consumers for me is like, it's like an easy solution for companies. I think it's a dead end if we really care about privacy. But I do think is a much more interesting concept, and I think we're not talking about this enough, is this, like, what are some of the technical solutions, right? So technologies that we can use. Because like the problem that I see and I could talk about this forever, but one of the problems that I see right now is that like if the trade-off is between service and convenience and value and insights, consumers are never going to pick privacy, right? So the way that we're pitching it right now, and big companies are pitching it because it's a very convenient narrative, is they're saying, we have to have your data because otherwise there's no way that we can provide you the service that we're providing. That's like the Netflix story, it's like the Google Maps story. It's like, it's everywhere. And I do think like breaking down this dichotomy of saying, well, you can either have service or you can have privacy. I think for me, that's the biggest conversation that we should be having. And there are a couple of solutions that I think are already out there that are not being pushed for enough because nobody knows about them. And they're not even part of the conversation because the tech monopolies are so good at kind of maintaining this dichotomy. I know this is a very long-winded response to your question, and I promise that I'm going to come back to that. But I think you're absolutely right in that targeting to some extent, and you see this like in when it comes to algorithmic bias, right? So it's not just that we might be making the wrong predictions for certain groups of people. So because for some people, we just don't have enough data. So getting a good sense of who someone is might be harder for some groups than for others. And then also by excluding people from the marketplace or whatever that is, by having this targeted profile, I think that's super critical to answer. Yeah, like 100% agree. That's the stuff that I think about every single day. Okay, so here's before, and we're going to come back to that in just a second. And before we do that, there's like one thing that I think is helping us transition into this world of how should we be thinking about privacy, right? So what is different in the world of big data that requires us to redefine how we think about privacy and privacy protection? Oops, sorry, I just closed my window. Let me bring it back up. Right. Okay, back in the game. I was trying to get a send line, but I think we still have 15 minutes. Maybe Monica, if you can give me a heads up when we're nearing like 5 minutes.
Sure thing.
And feel free to ask questions throughout. I'm going to go through this super quickly, but the idea here is that we collected a survey of like how willing people are to have big data being used for predictive purposes in different contexts. And so we asked CBS executives, and back in the day when I was still at Cambridge, we collected this pretty big data set of more than 34,000 people around the world in the context of like trust and predictive technologies with Edelman back in the day. And what I want to show you, so here's just like a few, and I'll skip some of them, but just a few questions that we asked them is like, should your text and private messages be analyzed to make the language and online advertising more relevant to you? You see, so those are the CBS executives, and it matches like so most people say no, first of all, so all the stuff that I showed you so far, most people are quite opposed to having this technology used. But you see that the view of the CBS executives who are potentially leading this change is relatively close to what the general population thinks. Now, if you take another question, should the financial services industry use predictive technologies to assess the likelihood of you defaulting on your loan? The picture looks pretty different. So now you see CBS executives, vast majority is like, this sounds like a wonderful idea, because most likely we're already doing this. And a small, like less than half of the population says that this is actually something that they would want. And to some extent, I think this is something that we have to keep in mind as leaders and as people who work with technology, is that the way that we think about it might not correspond to the way that other people think about it, right? So if you roll out a technology and you use data in a specific way, you might see all the benefits and you might understand what's actually behind it, but the general population or the users of your product might have a very different sense. So like the one thing that I always advise companies to do is just kind of think of the user check. So if you decide that you want to use data in a specific way, like ask yourself, would you be happy for your daughter, your spouse, someone that you love to use the product? And if the answer is no, or you feel like this would be a bit sketchy and you would feel that is to some extent too privacy invading, then it's maybe a good point to kind of stop and think if there's any other way that you can actually implement this. Then this is a comparison that I think is interesting, because the first one just asked about, should the financial services industry use data to predict loans? And this one here says, should we be using predictive technologies to pair you with account managers and advisors? So this is, again, like same data, it's just a very different use. And now you see that the picture looks very different. Now, actually, people in the general population also say, well, this is something that actually has value to us. And that seems like a good use of data. And I'm now kind of clicking through this just relatively quickly. But the point that I want to make is that, and we see this time and again, so people aren't super happy to, for example, have their data be used to determine the price of their insurance. But they're happy for it to be used if you want to see how different pharmaceuticals, for example, play out and are effective in different social demographic groups. So if it benefits the greater good, people are much happier to share their data. So it's really this idea that context matters. And this is why I think we just need to shift away from, I'm going to say this in a second, but we need to shift away from this focus on what data is being collected, who collects it, where is it stored, and really kind of ask the question, how is it being used? And there's like one theory that I think is really valuable in this context. It's called contextual integrity. But the idea behind it is that privacy is defined by the appropriate flow of information. So it's not necessarily data per se, but it's how it's being used. And what she defines, Helen Nissenbaum defines as appropriate flow, is if the flow of information conforms to contextual information norms, right? So if we would all agree that in this particular context, this particular use of data is something that we want as a society, then that's fine and it's not a violation of privacy. If suddenly my pictures that I posted on Facebook, they end up on a website that I don't want them to end up on, or they're being used to make inferences about my political ideology and then used to target me, they're being used in a way that I couldn't expect and other people wouldn't agree that this is something that we want, then it's essentially violating privacy. And what I like about it is that to some extent it allows for cultural adaptation, right? So some cultures, some countries might be happy for the data to be used in a specific way. And it also allows for this adaptation of privacy over time, because norms might change. Like what we think today is incredibly invasive and intrusive, like the 2 generations from now might think that this is entirely acceptable, right? So it's really this shift from who collects what data and where is it stored to how is it being used. And one of the ways of thinking about it, which I really, really like, is this idea that we should be treating data as radioactive material. So there should be a cost for companies to collect data, because right now there's absolutely no cost, right? If Facebook can collect as much data as they want, and all they do is benefit from it. There's no cost of collecting that data, even if they're not using it. If there was something like a cost to it, and we kind of appreciate that data is inherently dangerous when it comes to privacy, then there could be something like a tax that you have to pay for the data collection. And that means now you have like a more balanced view from the company side, right? So, because paying that tax might be fine if you benefit as much from improving services and getting more revenue. But if the data is just costly and it doesn't get you anything, then you probably wouldn't do it. And right now, there's just no incentive for companies to not collect their data in the first place. Okay, so now let me just see if I can get the chat back. If anyone has a question. Anyone has a question before we're diving into the solutions part. And I'm keeping that solutions part relatively light, you'll see. So I want to touch on some of the solutions that I think are interesting. I'm not going to dive into the specific ways of implementing them, but I want you to have heard of some of these things, because I do think that we're going to see a lot more of them in the coming years. Any questions up to this point? Great. Okay, so I already touched on this a little bit in my response to Bjorn. It's like this idea that the way that we think about it right now, it's oftentimes it's personalization, it's convenience, it's value, or we can have privacy. And that's the choice that we give most consumers right now. And what I would like to see us discuss is essentially how can we get the best of 2 worlds? Like how can we have something that's convenient and personal, but also maintain people's privacy? And there's a few, and the way that I've structured it is essentially saying there's a few problems that we have when it comes to data, and here's some of the solutions that we can think about it. One is, and this is also coming back to your question, Bjorn, is like what we know as the privacy paradox. So people say that they care about privacy, but then when it comes to translating that into behavior, almost nobody changes it. And I think this is because we oftentimes derive value from using these products. And one way to think about solutions for this problem is like generally, like how do we change behavior? And you can think of it as like launching a rocket into space. What you need is motivation, and you need to reduce friction. And that's essentially how I think about how do we change behavior. So people to some extent are motivated to kind of protect their privacy, right? As I said in the beginning, it's like this fundamental human need. People say that they have intentions to care for their privacy, but right now there's just way too much friction for people to actually do it. So right now it's just incredibly hard to care about your privacy and translate it into behavior. So one of the solutions that has been suggested is what's called privacy by design, and it's quite broad and not super well defined. But one of the solutions, and this is true across different contexts, is just changing the default, right? If the default right now is that you have to opt out of your data being collected, almost nobody's going to do that. If the default was you have to opt in, now suddenly the burden is placed on the companies who have to convince you that by them taking your data, they're actually improving the service so much so that you're willing to share the data voluntarily. Then contextual targeting. So the problem is we do want personalized information, but we don't necessarily want companies to create these profiles about us. So this is, I think, a very simple solution. And I do think that we're going to see this more and more. So like there's, I have a good friend at Apple who's in the product space. And this is like where they are thinking this is going in the near future, is that contextual targeting. So you're not making these profiles, which is also harder for people to do now that Apple got rid of the advertiser ID tracking, but it's kind of targeting it to the specific moment, what people are looking for. So it's somewhat closer to the search model of Google. So if I was interested in running a marathon, you would kind of, in that moment, without necessarily knowing who I am, kind of give me the ads for sneakers or whatever it is that you want to sell to me. And now here's two solutions that I think are really undervalued, that are somewhat technological. And I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I just wanted to have heard of them and get the idea behind it. So that's the problem, that we all oftentimes benefit from sharing data, right? So if we pull health data, we can have much better insights. If Google Maps works because it collects a lot of data for us about us, but we can't really be sure that it's being fully anonymized. And there's like a very neat example of Bill Welch, who's like the former governor of Massachusetts. And they, at some point, Massachusetts decided to release public anonymized records of hospital visits of state employees. So they got rid of all the personal information, name, and so on and so forth. However, and he had actually gone on this campaign kind of trying to persuade like the people living in Massachusetts that this was all fully anonymized and like they had nothing to worry about when it comes to privacy. But what someone did is essentially they combined the anonymized data with like the public voter registration records, and they're based on a few pieces of information. So zip code, gender, and date of birth. Very quickly, there was only one person who matched the same characteristics in both data sets. So in a matter of days, they had identified Bill Welch in this huge data set and essentially shown that what is anonymized data is really easy to kind of re-identify if you combine it with other data sets. And that's what it's called, a linkage attack. You see that, and this is true for most Americans who can be identified this way. It's called a linkage attack. You see this in different contexts. But one of the solutions that's been discussed is this idea of differential privacy. So you're adding a bit of noise to the data without changing the main insights that you can derive from them. And here's just a very simplified version of how this could work. So let's just assume we have Netflix and they have recommendation models. We all benefit. We all benefit from them actually getting some insights from what we like. So you have people who kind of rate these movies based on how much they like it. All this information goes to Netflix. And they actually were the victim of a linkage attack. So they made public data, they made data publicly available. Someone matched it with IMDb and essentially de-anonymized the entire anonymized data set. What differential privacy does, it says, so let's say this is Fred up here, and Fred doesn't really want for someone to know that what his profile looks like. So what differential privacy does, it sometimes makes up data for Fred, and then it, again, like simplified, it flips a coin. And if it's heads, it kind of submits the real data. If it's tails, then it submits the fake data. And what that means is Fred's privacy is now to some extent protected because now it's no longer deterministic. Now you can't be sure that the data you see from Fred is actually attached to Fred's real preferences. Now,
Professor, I'm just going to interject to see if there's any more questions for the last 4 minutes.
Great.
Just to see if there's anybody from the crowd that would like to ask about this last section. If not, I'll let you carry on. Any questions from the group?
I know, sorry, I can't see the time, so I'm like a little bit in the, thanks for the heads up of 4 minutes. If it's okay, I'm just gonna go through the last two things in 2 minutes, and then I'm also happy to stay like 5 minutes, 10 minutes longer if someone wants. But yeah, so here the idea is that we're now protecting Fred's privacy. And this is here the magic that you just have to go with me. So what we don't want, right? So we don't want to just add all the noise and make up data, because then the recommendation system breaks down. But there's statistical ways in which we can say, we know how the noise is distributed. So we, on the level of the individual, we can add this noise to protect Fred's privacy, but we still have a very good sense of what the overall distribution looks like, such that the insights that the model generates are not necessarily jeopardized in that they can't make the best predictions anymore. And you see that in the context of health data, right? So it's essentially saying, we want all of the data in the data set, but the model is optimized such that if I take out any one person, the insights that the model generates don't really change. The second one, and this is like, I'm probably even a bigger fan of this one, they're also oftentimes combined, is the idea that we want personalized information and services, but we don't necessarily want to submit the data to companies in the first place, right? Because if they have the data, they have to make sure that it's protected. So the solution that has been suggested, which is called federated learning or decentralized learning, is essentially saying, instead of me having to submit all of my data to the company, I now have super powerful devices because we all have smartphones. So instead of me submitting the data, the company submits the insights. So again, going back to Netflix, so the way that it typically works is like all of these people submit their data to Netflix, they kind of do the machine learning on their central servers, and then that's how they make their recommendation. Federated learning essentially works the opposite way. So it makes use of the fact that we all have these super powerful computers, right? Like if you think about a smartphone, it's like so much more powerful than computers were like 10 years ago. So what Netflix can do is they can send the recommendation model they have to our local devices. And now we can update these models on the local device. So my phone knows which movies I like. It updates the model on my device, which already improves my experience. But now the question is, how can everybody benefit from this? And what it does now, instead of submitting the data, so we get rid of the data never leaves the phone. But what leaves the phone in an encrypted way is the model. So now Netflix can learn from my phone who's updated the model, has adjusted the weights, right? You can think of it as weights. And now that information is being passed on to Netflix, but Netflix doesn't know anything about my raw data. It just knows, okay, here's how I should be adjusting the model such that we can make better predictions. And that's the idea of federated learning, is that essentially you're training on the local device and people don't have to ever have their data leave their phones. This is like small thing. And then finally, regulation, and I'm not going to spend too much time here. I do think it's super necessary as a signal, because there's oftentimes, if you think about the ads model, there's just no incentive for companies to change because it works beautifully there for them. It just doesn't work for the consumer. So I think you need these regulations to kind of increase transparency and control, and really just send this signal, even if it's difficult to implement. Okay, so here, privacy, again, if there's one thing that I want you to take away is like, it's not about secrecy, it's really about control, and how can we get the best of two worlds. And I'm sorry that I talked for such a long time. If there's any questions, I'm super happy to stay a little bit longer. It's funny because I was like, I want this to be a conversation, and then I just conversed with myself. But if there's any questions, super happy to answer them.
One question I had in the chat directed to me is, could we have the copy of this presentation? Would you be able to send that? And I can distribute.
Let me give you a 2 minute response to this. No, I'm going to send it, yeah.
Great. Any other questions from the group before we wrap up?
Yeah, Vivian.
Professor Matz, thanks for giving the talk. I had a question about, you mentioned a little bit about different cultures and different regions around the world kind of having different contexts and understanding of this control and maybe even different preferences. So for example, in China, like facial recognition, we read a lot about that on the street, and crimes have gone down in major cities because now people are being identified on the street and different types of things, visual, audio, getting picked up in that sense. So it kind of makes sense. People like it, but in many ways, the central government also owns that data. So what's kind of your view on that as far as it doesn't have to be China specific, but more so who should own that data? Right now, in the US, we see companies kind of having it, governments taking it, and yeah, they're taking it kind of for free. But if the consumers do have the right to own our own data at the same time, do consumers start monetizing that in some ways? How do we really benefit? So just curious kind of what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a super interesting question, right? Because there's always this argument that governments make that that's what they need to get a sense of what's happening inside and outside of the country. And you see that, which is interesting in the context of COVID, where people were suddenly much more willing to have the government track whatever it is that they're doing. Israel implemented this a very invasive system where they track essentially everybody. And to some extent, it was beneficial, right? So it's not saying that tracking is always like an invasion of your privacy that's unwelcome. I do think what it has to, and this is coming back to this idea that it depends on the context and how we're using it, but it has to be a public discussion. And I think that's what we're not having right now. So right now, the assumption is that companies just collect the data, they're using the data, the same with governments, and that they're just collecting the data and using the data, and the consumer has absolutely no sense of what's happening. And I don't think, even if you gave consumers the autonomy to make decisions, that they would be making wise decisions. Because again, like, they just don't understand it, right? It's like too much to ask for, and it's a too easy out for companies. But I do think there's like a distinction between government and companies, because companies, they're just doing it for profit, right? And for companies, I do think that there is solutions where you can say there's a trade-off between the technologies that you're using. There's a trade-off between how much value do you actually have to give to customers, right? If we're thinking that there's like this invisible hand that manages everything, to some extent, like the products that we could be seeing would be much better if there was something where we had an opt-in, and now the company really would have to take the burden and say, my product is so amazing and it's so much better than everything else you see that you want to share that data with me. So I think the cultural contexts are, for me, a super interesting natural experiment, because you have Europe, where there's like, you have the strictest data protection regulations. And I think to some extent they saw what doesn't work, right? So like for mid-sized and small businesses, it was a complete nightmare. But there's things that were actually really valuable. And then you have the US, which is somewhere in between, and obviously it's federal law, so it's like really difficult. And then you have China, which is like much more liberal in the use of data. And for me, it's interesting to see what it does, right? Because my expectation would have been that in China, because you know that the central government is using it in such a direct way, and it's like everybody knows, I might have expected that makes people a little bit more suspicious. But it's almost the opposite. That, as you said, like in China, I think people are much more, oh, this is actually, here it's useful. It's useful in the context of companies. It might be useful in the context of government. So I think to some extent, it's also just that people habituate so quickly. So we get used to it. And it's just kind of something that's running in the background. Nobody has capacity to have that top of mind all the time, right? Like, we have other stuff to do. We can't think about our privacy all the time. So I think it's a super fascinating natural experiment that we see how it plays out. And I don't know exactly. Any final questions? I know that we're already over time, so thanks for sticking around.
Okay, I don't see any more questions on the participant list. So thank you very much, Sandra, for your presentation today. It was very insightful. And thank you to everybody who joined the call today. Hopefully this inspires you to look a little deeper into how your data is being collected on your devices.
Amazing. Thank you, guys. And I'll share those slides.
Thank you, everyone.